Hi, my name's Matthias, and this is V Wanna Know. It's a podcast by V Magazine and powered by Yoox, the world's leading online store for fashion, design, and art that lasts a lifetime. On this show, we're diving into the world of the stranger fixations and lesser-known interests of some of the biggest names in music and fashion by pairing them with an expert in their field of interest. On today's show, Brittany Xavier. Brittany is a digital content creator and mastermind who has become one of the most familiar faces on Instagram and TikTok, racking up millions of followers and creating content with her husband and teenage daughter that has turned them into a bit of a wholesome, modern-day Brady Bunch on social media, just with way better clothes and a lot less kids. Brittany wants to know how a recent advancement in forensic science called genealogy is being used to solve some of the coldest cases in America. In particular, she wants to know how this new technology was used to identify and catch Joseph James DeAngelo, otherwise known as the Golden State Killer, who was arrested in April of 2018, more than 30 years after his notorious murder spree, which resulted in at least 13 deaths, 50 rapes, and 120 burglaries throughout California in the 1970s and 80s. To learn more about how DeAngelo, who himself was a police officer, was finally brought to justice, we spoke with American genealogy expert C.C. Moore, who pioneered the technology that was used to ultimately zero in on DeAngelo.
Investigators say the East Area rapist has attacked several teenage girls.
A 29-year-old wife was raped while her tied-up husband had to listen.
It's so warm in Concord tonight that people have their doors and windows open, but the police are saying lock up tight.
Every time the East Area rapist strikes in the new city, the police switchboard lights up.
And some leads develop, but a clear identification has not been made.
I was born and raised in Southern California. It's a small town called Glendora, California. And I'm the oldest of 4 kids. 2 sisters, a brother. My parents are still together. Am I talking too much about my childhood? Let's see. I feel like I had a very regular middle-class upbringing where I always had to work for anything I wanted. So I feel like that really set me up for where I'm at today. I went to college. I got pregnant my freshman year of college and had my daughter. Now she is 14. During that time, I started my blog as a hobby. I was working in a very corporate marketing job. So I started my blog as a hobby in 2013 and had no clue that it could just turn into what it is today, which is my full-time career with my husband. We have a team. My daughter's a little bit of a part of it now too, because she's her own teenage self. And yeah, it's kind of like a family business in a way now. So I do fashion, beauty, I'm on TikTok, we're growing our YouTube channel. But I really started out with my blog and Instagram is where I really started my whole, my foot in the door in fashion. And there's been more channels that have evolved since then. And now true crime.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. It's getting just used to this whole new being at home all the time. But with the pregnancy, it's been fun because it's a perfect time for me to be pregnant. So
We've both gotten a little bit curvier during COVID, but you're actually growing a human inside of you. So you have
exactly.
You have a better excuse than I do. How is COVID pregnancy? Does it feel that different than normal out in California?
So we decided we weren't going to do any travel during the pregnancy just to cut down on any COVID risk. And we did have a trip booked that we were going to go to in March. And when I found out I was pregnant in December, we basically just decided it was best to cancel everything and just be at home. We'll do road trips. You can travel safely in your car, but it is tough because I'm getting to the point where I'm like, I really need to go somewhere. I feel trapped in a way. I'm just at home all the time. But
yeah, I hear
cases
you.
in LA are doing a lot better with everyone getting vaccinated. So things are looking up.
So, you have beauty, fashion, babies, and then now we're going to maybe add true crime to your
oh my gosh,
to your
I'm
resume.
So excited.
When I got the email that you wanted to do something true crime related, I freaked out because I fall asleep every night listening to murder podcast. If it's not a murder going into my ear, I can't sleep.
Yeah.
So I was super pumped that that was what you wanted to do.
And I listen to podcasts every morning when I'm doing my makeup. So I start my day a little bit on edge. Like, you're like wanting, sometimes if it's like a part 1, part 2, I want to know what happens. My husband's always like, why are you lagging on your makeup this morning? Because I'm like, it's almost over. I'm just trying to finish this last part. But yeah, I have an addiction, and I love when I get a notification that my new episodes are ready. It's more an addiction in a good way because it's made me more aware and safe about my surroundings and just common sense things that you wouldn't think about. But because I listen to the podcast, I feel like I have a little bit more self-awareness now.
100%.
And I literally told my daughter, she was doing all the interviews for high school. We had to kind of narrow down like what she wanted to do for college. I said, what about a forensic scientist? Just because I want to know about everything. She's like, that seems fun, but would I have to go to school for 8 years? I'm like, I don't know. We'll have to figure that out.
It's not important.
She's like, would I have to be a doctor? I'm like, I don't know.
Somebody walked into my apartment the other day because I'd left my door open and didn't realize like a neighbor was like, your door was open.
You're like, thanks for saving my life.
If somebody did want to kill me, like I am a very easy target, and like, please don't try for it. But I feel like in starting to listen to the podcasts and watching all the documentaries and whatnot, you sort of realize it's not, these are not like urban legends. These are things that actually could happen, and certain bits of it are way more common than I ever thought before.
Right.
It came out of nowhere for me. I didn't really even understand what true crime was. And then I think I got really hooked when I understood like, this is pretty commonplace actually.
Yeah. And the people that commit them are usually people you wouldn't, what can you expect a murderer to look like? Or what you think they're going to be hiding out all creepy, like how you would think in a movie, but it's never like that. It's like the guy next door who has 3 kids. And that's what's even the most weird part of it for me is it could be one of my neighbors right now. And, you have no idea because you really don't know the people that are next to you every day unless, you're running background checks. And sometimes they're not even on the radar because they're so good at getting away with it.
Like I was so inundated at one point that I did have to take a break because I was living my life thinking that like 1 in every 2 people get murdered. That's how much I was listening to murder podcasts where I was like, this is actually too much and I need to shut it down.
Yeah.
But the one that we're going to be talking a little bit about today, the Golden State Killer, was such a huge one that's like unbelievable. Like I was just going to the Wikipedia page and I would literally rather read the Torah. It is so long and it's so complicated, this whole case. And it's just crazy that they so recently sort of got to the bottom of it.
Yeah, I'm very excited to discuss because I'm very curious to know too, would something like that have happened in today's technology?
Yeah, I don't know. The amount of stuff he got away with was insane. It was like 50 rapes. Like how do you get away 50 times with that and then more? So with that said, let's just bring Cece in and we can start hacking away at her brain about all of this. Cece Moore.
Hello.
Hi, Cece. My name is Matthias, and we have Brittany Xavier here, who, well, both of us wanted to just pick your brain about so many things related to forensic science. But we were wondering if just to start, you could tell us and our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm Cece Moore. I'm the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, and my team has helped law enforcement solve over 150 cases, mostly murders and rapes, using the techniques that I pioneered to reunite biofamilies over the last decade. The ABC miniseries, The Genetic Detective, followed my work last summer. I've also been the genetic genealogist on PBS's Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr. since 2013. And I founded the largest social media genetic genealogy group in the world, which is called the DNA Detectives on Facebook. And I'm the founder of the Institute for Genetic Genealogy, which holds annual conferences.
Wow, it's no small feat. So you've had a big impact on everything that we're going to talk about. One of the subjects that we definitely wanted to spend some time on was the Golden State Killer. Brittany, I know you had a couple questions.
Yes. First of all, I have to say I'm a big fan. I listen to true crime quite a bit, and Parabon is such a leader in, I wouldn't even say the market or the industry. What do you call it?
Field?
The field.
The field.
Yeah.
I'm trying to switch off my fashion
it's a
brain.
brand new field. It was odd when I first started calling it a field or an industry, because when I started, it was just all citizen scientists, volunteerism. So I guess we can now call it a field.
It is insane what the work you have done to help so many families, and just thinking outside the box on how you're able to solve these cases. It just amazes me every time I hear Parabon. I'm like, oh, it's going to be solved. They're going to figure it out.
Well, I'm glad that that's what you expect.
Do you think you can walk us through what the Golden State Killer caused in the 70s and the 80s in California?
Sure. So the Golden State Killer was responsible for at least 13 murders, probably more, 50 rapes, and about 120 burglaries across California from 1973 to 1986. So he was terrorizing different communities across California. So he didn't just stay in one. There were multiple communities that he was victimizing. And it was so serious that many people changed their way of life because of it. I mean, it had a real impact on how people were living their lives. Now, as you know, I didn't work on this particular case, but the techniques that I developed for unknown parentage or adoption is what were used to help identify him.
Do you think right off the bat that this is just something that I've always thought about is, could the Golden State Killer have had as much success with the murders in today's time? Because we were talking about this earlier, that now there's so much technology around houses. They have cameras. There's all this documentation of where people are going with the street cams. Do you think that something like this is possible in today's time?
I don't. I actually think the time of serial killers is over. And much of that is because of the newer technologies. But even if somehow they're able to slip through that, with genetic genealogy, we would be able to identify them much more quickly. And so we should be able to cut short any planned careers of serial rapists or serial killers, because they just won't have the chance to keep going for years like they could back in the 70s and 80s.
What did they say? That was the golden age of serial killer. All the famous ones came out of that with time zone, which is crazy because it was the opportunity was there and no one really could track it.
Right. California and the Pacific Northwest just seemed to be hotbeds for serial killers at that time. And it makes me so happy to know that that doesn't ever have to happen again.
Right.
Cece, can you just give kind of like a bigger picture of what genetics and what forensics mean, as well as some of like the major developments that we've had in the last couple of years when it comes to solving crimes?
Well, I think part of the reason that the Golden State Killer stopped attacking in 1986 is because that was around the first time that DNA was used to identify a suspect in a violent crime. And as a former law enforcement officer, I think he was well aware of the advancements and the capabilities that that meant. I mean, we can only speculate, but I think the timing is almost too exact to be coincidental. So since that time, they've been using traditional forensic profiles, a handful of genetic markers called STRs, to identify criminals. But what we're doing with investigative genetic genealogy is quite different. And it's only been for the last 3 years. In fact, exactly 3 years since the Golden State Killer suspect was arrested in April 2018. We're now looking at hundreds of thousands of genetic markers across the genome. And they're a different type of genetic marker called SNPs. And with that large amount of genetic information, we're able to detect and predict distant cousins. So we can use the family trees of second, third, fourth, fifth cousins to reverse engineer the identity of an unknown suspect. And so that's been a huge leap forward, because previously you had to get that exact match. You had to have that one-to-one match. So D'Angelo would have had his DNA taken for some other crime later to be compared for this to be solved. But with what we do, we can use his distant cousins and all violent criminals' distant cousins in order to try to determine who they are.
Do you mind just going through the specifics with the Golden State Killer, what his sentencing was and how we got to where we are with him?
So in order to perform genetic genealogy on the Golden State Killer suspect case, they needed to find a good sample. And so they were able to find a rape kit that had never been processed. So they had a nice sample that they could use that was viable for this type of processing. They had a SNP genotype profile that was created by Family Tree DNA, and then they uploaded that to GEDmatch. And they were able to get cousins close enough that it allowed them to eventually reverse engineer his family tree. So they built the family trees of the people sharing DNA with him, even though they were distant, and then identified common ancestors, and then reversed the tree and did what I call reverse genealogy or descendancy research, where they looked to find who are all the descendants of these common ancestors. And they had, a number of men, and they kept narrowing it down. And I think eventually they narrowed it down to about 6 men that could potentially be him. And they looked at different factors. Where did he live? What was his age? What was his occupation previously? What was his eye color? That type of thing. And they got it down to 2 most likely. And one of them was D'Angelo. And one of the keys in that case is they could tell that this unknown person had some Italian ancestry. And so that helped as well. He wasn't fully Italian, but he did have a great grandparent who was Italian. And so they just kept narrowing and narrowing and narrowing using different factors once the genetic genealogy had narrowed it to a pool of candidates. Then they went out and collected that trash. I think there was a tissue in the trash. He was the only male in that household, so they knew it had to be his DNA if it was male. And it was a match to that STR profile, that CODIS profile that they had had for decades. And so I think most people know the rest of the story. He was arrested. It was a very long court process. And then, fairly recently, he took a plea deal and pled guilty, and he'll spend the rest of his life behind bars.
He definitely wouldn't have been caught.
Yeah.
That's the crazy thing. He just living his life.
Yeah, he really stayed under the radar after 1986. He doesn't appear to have committed any more crimes. And, that was a good time to stop because of the use of DNA, because of the advanced technology that started being used.
There are such brilliant people in this world that they were able to figure that out, including yourself. But this guy basically was getting away with it and then had a 3-decade period of doing nothing where he probably thought he was good to go.
Probably thought he was completely in the clear.
Oh, he clearly did. Did you see how angry he looked?
Yeah.
I mean, I think he thought he was definitely in the clear. He had his roast in the oven when they arrested him. He was living the good life.
So insane to think that someone could be living next to you and committed all those murders and you have no clue, because neighbors said he was kind of finicky, but he wasn't, he was a regular, kind of a grumpy guy, but not really anything that's not really out of the normal. He rode his motorcycle.
You wouldn't question it.
Yeah. So that's what's more strange.
It's shocking. In all of these cases where they're really old, cold cases, people are absolutely shocked because oftentimes it is someone who just faded back into normal life and society. Some of them were very successful and nobody would have ever imagined what they were capable of doing. It's really crazy. I mean, I think
so crazy.
We're finding a new class of criminal in these cases. They're people who apparently were able to stop. And because of that, they stayed under the radar of law enforcement all this time.
For specifically the Golden State Killer, what prompted law enforcement to look into this type of testing?
I think there was a lot of forward-thinking law enforcement officials across the country because I had been approached by dozens of law enforcement officials, detectives, coroners who had seen something on television or read an article about my work and wondered if my techniques would work on their cases. And so I don't think it's too surprising that on such a big case where they were just out of leads, that Paul Holes eventually did come to this idea that, well, maybe we could use genetic genealogy and direct-to-consumer DNA databases. Obviously, it wasn't something that he knew a lot about initially, so he had to really investigate that. And he found out that Barbara Ray Venter had already worked on a law enforcement case using genetic genealogy. And so that's why he reached out to her. So it actually wasn't the first law enforcement case that used investigative genetic genealogy, but it's the first one where a suspect was arrested thanks to genetic genealogy.
Got it.
So was that then like a big turning point in all of this because they realized it had such a massive impact that made so many headlines? I can only assume that this practice is going to continue to get more and more popular.
Yeah, it was a huge turning point. It was the day that genetic genealogy changed forever and started to become a household name. Prior to that, it was still somewhat of a niche thing. I mean, it had gotten really popular. You know, we had 25 million people that had taken DNA tests across the consumer DNA testing companies, but still most people weren't really aware of it or really the potential power of genetic genealogy. They might know they could send in their saliva and they could get their percentages back where their ancestry was from, but I don't think most people really realized the power for human identification. And so that was a huge turning point. And law enforcement was certainly not aware of it largely. And even to this day, there's a lot of detectives and agencies who still don't really understand it. We're still trying to get the word out and let people know that there's hope for these unsolved cases. If they have DNA, we can get these solved. And so for the families that are still waiting, for the surviving victims of violent crime, for the detectives that still have this case they want to solve before they retire, there is hope.
So if I was to submit my DNA through, let's say, 23andMe or Ancestry.com, technically that doesn't go into automatic testing, right? I'd have to give an authorization for it to go into the next step where law enforcement can pull from it. Is that how it works?
Sort of. You're right that it doesn't automatically go in. And that is because 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and MyHeritage DNA, which are the three largest consumer DNA testing databases, all have terms of service that bar law enforcement from using their database. So if you want to support law enforcement's efforts and you want your DNA to be used for these purposes, you have to make proactive steps and you have to download your raw data from those companies and then upload it to a database called GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA that does allow law enforcement matching. So nobody's DNA is just going to be used because they happen to take a DNA test somewhere. You have to move that DNA into one of the two databases that do allow law enforcement. And at GEDmatch, then you have to actively opt in. There's a little checkbox that you have to say, yes, my DNA can be used for law enforcement matching. So I think that's a big misconception out there. And I'm glad you asked the question.
Yeah, I was listening to something about that because I had assumed that mine was already going, like I wanted it to go into it, but for the testing, but I would listen to something else and they had clarified that no, that's actually a privacy issue. They can't just opt everyone in, or no one would be interested in downloading these ancestry tracers. So
yeah, I think it's important for people to know they can still participate in consumer genomics. They can still learn about their health and their relatives and their genetic ancestry without being put in this pool of law enforcement matching. So for the people that aren't comfortable with that, it doesn't mean you can't take a DNA test. You still can. You just don't opt in, move your DNA into one of the two databases that allow it.
I'm always curious. Let's say there's a family who has this really old DNA. They want to get it retested. Do they have to cover the testing themselves, or does it depend if it's an open case and the law enforcement covers that cost?
When you say really old DNA, what do you mean?
Maybe 10, 15 years back, they're technically an open case, but they've never solved it and they want to get it retested, but it's not really a priority list on the case file, if that makes sense.
Right. So they need to contact the detectives in charge of that case and try to educate them about genetic genealogy and encourage them to use that technique. I'm contacted by families all the time and by some surviving victims as well of violent crime. And I have to advise them that I can't do anything without the agency's permission. I can't access that DNA. So there's a couple requirements, and one is that there is remaining DNA left. We can't use that traditional forensic profile that was created initially from the crime scene DNA. That handful of STRs is not compatible with genetic genealogy. So we have to be able to go back to the original biological sample, so that original physical evidence, and then reanalyze it from scratch. So unfortunately, that means some cases can't use genetic genealogy because there's no remaining evidence. It's all been consumed. But if they have that, then the next step is getting the agency on board, getting that detective excited about the idea of trying genetic genealogy. And if they'll submit that DNA to Parabon or one of the other companies doing this, then you can move forward with that.
I guess I'm curious, like for other cases where we know that there's DNA, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe with like John Benet Ramsey and whatnot, there was DNA that was left. So is the reason that cases where there is DNA, that those have not been submitted for this, for example, is that just because those cases are closed and there's not the manpower behind them to open it again? Like if we have this technology now, why are there still some cases that haven't been solved using it?
I think some of the high profile cases, there's a lot of misconceptions about out there. Jean Benet Ramsey being one of them. I get emails every day asking me to work that case. And I don't have insider information, but I am familiar with other cases where people believe that there is DNA remaining when there is not. So there are a number of high profile cases that I would love to work, that the agencies would love to use genetic genealogy for, but they just don't have that remaining physical evidence anymore. You could have a small amount of, say, touch DNA and still not necessarily have enough for genetic genealogy. And so I think there's a lot of misunderstandings out there. And I actually have a lot of sympathy for the detectives and agencies on some of those cases, because people think they're not trying everything. They're not doing everything to solve a case, when in most of the cases I'm aware of, they are trying everything, but they do have limitations of what they have available. And so, I think there are some smaller agencies who maybe aren't fully on board with genetic genealogy yet, aren't totally educated about it. But I think for the most part, any agency that has a really high profile case has either run out of the physical evidence and there isn't any available, even if people think there is, or they are trying genetic genealogy, but we haven't been successful yet, but they just haven't put that out there.
Yeah, I was definitely somebody that was under that misconception.
On some cases, without speaking about any particular case, there are cases where we or another company have tried to genotype the evidence or tried to do whole genome sequencing, and it's highly contaminated or degraded, or they don't have enough of it. So in some cases, it has been attempted, but failed, unfortunately.
What do you think is the next step in this type of testing? Like, would it be that they would be able to test really, really, really small amounts, or would it be the ways that they're connecting the dots?
I think it's both. So one, because there's so much attention on genetic genealogy now for the very first time ever, there are advancements being made very quickly and all the time. Dr. Ed Green is doing incredible work. He has developed a way to get autosomal DNA out of the hair shaft. So that opens up a lot of cases that were not open before because there was no remaining DNA, but they did have a hair or two hairs. And we're now having success with getting the SNP profile from the hair shaft, thanks to Dr. Green. So that's incredible. So what's the next step? I don't know, but we keep seeing smaller and smaller amounts being able to be used. We have had success with touch DNA on some cases. We've worked cases with really degraded, contaminated DNA. We've worked cases where there was a mixture between the perpetrator and the victim. And so I just see that getting better and better as we go. The other thing I'd like to see is more active cases. So we're still mostly working these cold cases, which is really important. But active cases can really change the level of public safety and stop these perpetrators in their tracks before they can victimize anyone else. So I would like to see agencies start embracing genetic genealogy as just another tool in their toolbox. As soon as they don't get that CODIS hit, they should bring investigative genetic genealogy in and do it right away. And I think that will really increase public safety.
That's such a good point, because it seems like it is, you hear about all these cases that are old that are being solved, but I mean, I guess you wouldn't hear about a case stopped in its tracks because it really wouldn't make headlines, because hopefully everything would go okay and public safety would be not an issue anymore.
Well, they have to have committed a violent crime in order for it to meet the terms of service at GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. So they would have already victimized one person, but hopefully we can stop it at that.
Right.
There was a woman that was attacked in St. George, Utah. It was covered on my series. She was a 79-year-old beloved member of their community, and she was raped and beat in her home. And we were very afraid that he would reoffend, escalate, or return to her home and kill her. And so that was really a lot of pressure. I mean, all these cases are important, but I felt such a burden to try to help identify him before he struck again. And we were able to do that. And even he admitted that it was a miracle, a blessing for him that he was stopped before he did something even worse. So I think we can see more and more and more of that. Unfortunately, it won't stop them before they commit a crime, but it'll keep them from committing multiple crimes like the Golden State Killer or any of these other serial killers or rapists. So when someone commits a violent crime and leaves DNA behind, which they almost always do if it's a personal violent crime, you know, if there's a rape, it's very hard not to leave your DNA. If you are stabbing someone or some sort of up close murder, it's very difficult not to leave your DNA. So in almost all of those cases, there'll be DNA, and then that will be processed in their traditional way, where they look at those 20 STR markers for CODIS and they compare it against all the known offenders that are in CODIS. If it doesn't hit, if it doesn't get a match, that just means that this person has never been arrested and had their DNA taken before. So they don't know who it is. And that's pretty much where it stops. There is something called familial search, which California allows, where they can compare to see if anyone's a really close relative in CODIS, but they can only detect first-degree relatives. So parent, child, full siblings usually. Anything more distant is very difficult because you only have these 20 genetic markers. So then at that point, if they immediately submitted that DNA for SNP genotyping or whole genome sequencing, we could then perform genetic genealogy on it and try to identify that unknown person. Once that person's identified and arrested, then their DNA sample will have a name in CODIS. You know, until then, it's been this unknown perpetrator. So then it'll be in there. If any other crime were to come up that had their DNA in it, they would have that match in CODIS and they wouldn't need genetic genealogy anymore.
Is this something that genetic genealogy could be like a CODIS database eventually, or no, it always has to be done manually?
Well, it's really different. So CODIS is compelled DNA. That's DNA that is taken by law because somebody has committed a crime. Whereas genetic genealogy is based on voluntary submission of DNA, people who have voluntarily uploaded it or taken a DNA test at Family Tree DNA and then opted in or didn't opt out of the law enforcement matching. I don't think we want to change that. But it is an interesting question in another sense, which is in 2014, I spoke at a law enforcement conference and I tried to convince them to create a whole new database using these SNP profiles for exactly this purpose. So I wasn't seeing them as using GEDmatch per se. I was proposing that they start their own database with compelled DNA. And you could do that. But now I realize that I was sort of naive. I didn't realize what a huge undertaking creating CODIS had been in the first place. So I think that that would be optimal if all of these arrestees or people that are convicted of violent crimes were actually having their DNA added to a separate database that was SNP genotyping, because then we'd be able to find their first, second, third cousins, also who committed crimes. But there's a lot of ins and outs about that. And I'm sure there'd be a lot of arguments with the ACLU and, privacy experts. So CODIS markers, what we use for law enforcement, were chosen in part because they don't tell you anything about the person, like medical risks or physical traits. It's really sort of uninformative genetic markers until you put them together for CODIS.
Okay.
Whereas SNP data, there's a lot more information in that. And so I think there would be a lot of pushback as far as creating an official law enforcement database.
Like that bias in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
That makes sense.
I mean, so it could be very powerful, but I don't see it happening anytime soon.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, this is so interesting. Now I want to switch fields.
Yeah, there's so many people who have gone into it recently for that reason. I get emails from students and from their parents all the time that they've been inspired to go into forensics. So that's really exciting. A lot of young women are going into it. I think it's going to be a fascinating next couple decades with this whole new group of young people that are interested in this.
What did you major? What did you study? If that's fine to ask.
Theater.
No, you did.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
What?
I don't have a science background or science degree. I started as an opera major at USC, and then I switched to the theater department because I wanted to do the musicals there. So there's no degree for what I do. You still can't go to college and major in genetic genealogy. There's no certification or licensing. It wasn't till my 40s that I found this career. And it was a hobby. Nobody in the world was a professional at that point. And I was the first to call myself a professional genetic genealogist and actually try to make a career of it.
How did you learn about it then? Were you self-taught?
Yeah, I was. So there wasn't any way to learn about it because it didn't exist.
Yeah.
When 23andMe introduced their test, it was the first time SNP genotyping data was available to the public, where you could test your own DNA and find out your results for this type of DNA testing. And so myself and some others that were early adopters decided to try to see if we could use it for genealogy.
That is crazy.
And we were told by some scientists it wasn't possible because the recombination rate of this type of DNA is really fast, and they didn't think it would work. So we proved them wrong. And the rest is history, literally. But this came out of citizen scientists, out of volunteerism, passion, innovation, not from traditional science. So it's a really different origin story as compared to most fields and also most forensic science. And so it's really kind of taken the field by storm and by surprise, because no one was that interested in it when we were using it for genealogy or even adoption. So we were allowed to create this really powerful tool under the radar without anyone, seeking to regulate or stop what we were doing. So by the time people really became aware of it with the Golden State Killer arrest, it was a little late to put Pandora back in the box.
Right. Do you think that there is going to be some more formal way to get into this field now because it's so big with all these cases? I feel like people who, like I was saying earlier, Parabon, now I feel like I know the name so well because of what they're doing. Do you think that's going to be more and more where people are going to be like, I want to go to college for that, or I want to go right into my internship afterwards for this?
I think absolutely. It's still difficult right now. And I still feel guilty when I reply to people's emails and inquiries because there is no formal way. There is no direct path to this. I had to blaze my own trail, but you're right. It's going to change now that so many people are interested in this, that law enforcement is interested in it. There will be programs created that will make it much more easier to pursue this field, but we're not there yet. And people sometimes get upset with me. They're like,
why haven't you started a college degree yet?
Believe me, I'd love to,
Now you have to be the professor too.
So we do have our annual conference, Institute for Genetic Genealogy, that we're planning. We don't have the date yet, but we're hoping to do it in person.
Yeah. I mean, you can only take on so much, especially with the times we're in too, with everything being online. And
yeah, it's been kind of nice. I know for a lot of people, obviously they haven't been in the position I've been in, but I do all my work virtually anyway, unless I'm traveling to teach or film or something. And so I've been able to really just dig in and help solve a lot of cases during this lockdown. I didn't get any break. That's for sure. I've been working just as hard or harder.
Probably had more time because now you didn't have to travel as much either.
Exactly. It has given me more time to just dig in. And my team and I have solved a lot of cases during this, or helped solve a lot of cases during the pandemic lockdown. We're just waiting for a lot of them to still be confirmed because it has slowed down law enforcement's ability to be able to collect surreptitious DNA in some cases. So as you were aware in the Golden State Killer case, they collected his trash. They tried a couple different things because they have to get that surreptitious DNA or a DNA sample before they can arrest. Genetic genealogy is just considered a tip. It's like if you called in a name to Crime Stoppers, they can't arrest on that. They've got to build their case. And part of that is collecting a DNA sample. And that's gotten harder with the pandemic without people, driving around, dropping their cigarettes or, throwing a bottle of water in the trash. And so we have a lot of cases that are just waiting to be confirmed and officially solved that have been worked during this time.
Do you ever find you're on the track where you think something is going to be solved or it's going to be a match and you think you're on the right track, but you get to it and you realize it's not someone's family member?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, it's not to the point where, I've pointed at someone and said to law enforcement, it's that person. But there are a number of cases, including one right before we started this discussion, where I got an unexpected result from one of those kinship tests I mentioned. I had narrowed it down to 6 people. And there was one that is already a known sex offender, but his DNA was not in CODIS. So I thought it would probably be him. But the result I just got today ruled him out. Oh. So, it's got to be one of the other ones. And the Angie Dodge case that I worked out of Idaho Falls is a great example of this as well, where the genetic genealogy narrowed it down to 6 people, but there was a missing descendant. There was a 7th person who had not been raised with the family, who had been adopted by his stepfather, who I didn't find through the traditional research. And so we pretty much had ruled out the 6. And I'm thinking, well, it's got to be somebody in this family. Who is it? And I had to go back and revisit the research and get a second set of eyes on it before we found this missing 7th descendant that ended up being her killer.
That is insane. That's just so crazy.
I mean, we have to keep that in mind. Because of my earlier work, I'm well aware of misattributed paternities, of adoptions, unknown parentage. So it is something I'm always keeping in mind. And every single time I communicate a hypothesis to a detective, I include this caveat that it could be someone who was adopted out of the family. And so it's always possible there's someone we haven't found.
Can you name any of the other, have there been a handful of other really, really big cases that have been solved since the Golden State Killer using this method?
Well, my team has over 150 successful identifications, most of which were murders and rapes, some of them serial. The other handful of those were unidentified victims, where we've helped identify someone who was deceased but didn't have an identity. So, it's hard to say what people consider big. I worked on the April Tinsley case out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. She was a young girl who had been plucked off the street in her own neighborhood, raped and murdered, and just dumped on the side of the road. And it was a huge case for the Midwest. They had been trying to solve it for 30 years prior to genetic genealogy. So I think that one's considered a big case. But the case that's probably most important to me is the Angie Dodge case. And that's not because her case was more important than anyone else, but for a couple reasons. One, it was the first time we used highly degraded DNA in genetic genealogy, and I wasn't sure it was going to work. So the fact we were able to make that work was really important because it opened the door for a lot of other cases that had highly degraded DNA. And I went back and reassessed some of the other cases and was able to ultimately help solve those as well. The other thing that was important about that case is it was the first time someone was formally exonerated thanks to genetic genealogy, because Christopher Tapp had been convicted of her murder. And by identifying the true perpetrator, he finally had that felony murder conviction expunged. And that, as we can only imagine, is so important for somebody who has had to live under that horrible burden for 20 plus years in his case. So I'd like to see a lot more exonerations come from this. I have pretty frequent conversations with the Innocence Project. There are a lot of people in jail right now whose DNA doesn't match the crime scene DNA, and those are all prime for genetic genealogy use. So yeah, to me, that case was just so important because it's one thing to help arrest someone, right? But to have the opportunity to help clear someone's name, there's nothing better than that. I mean, it's just the best feeling I can imagine. Definitely the highlight of my career.
You're definitely ending like hell on earth
Yeah.
for these people who are in prison for crimes they didn't commit, which is the other huge side of this work. Not only finding the actual perpetrator, but people who have been falsely accused, getting them out of prison as well.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not a formal exoneration. It's just that they've been under the burden of suspicion for years. All these cases I've worked, there have been dozens or hundreds, sometimes thousands of persons of interest who turned out being innocent. And many of them have carried this burden of suspicion for years or decades, where their community, their family, the victim's family have thought that they were somehow involved in this crime. And so it's such an important thing for these people to have their name fully and finally cleared. And the sooner we can start using genetic genealogy in newer cases, the less likely innocent people will be pulled into these cases in the first place. So I think that really is the promise of investigative genetic genealogy, is not just these arrests that, is what most people focus on, but the fact that there will be eventually tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who will never get pulled into investigations wrongly in the first place. And that will help to keep people from eventually being convicted of crimes they didn't commit.
Do you recommend any nonprofits? You mentioned the Innocence Project. Is there anything else that even I could get involved in as far as whether it's, I don't know if it's volunteer or if it's monetary, but how can people get involved by helping people get either exonerated or getting DNA tested more?
It's a good question, and there aren't a lot of options for that right now. I would certainly like to see more of that. At Parabon, we have something called Justice Drive for agencies that can't afford genetic genealogy. We put cases on Justice Drive and people can help fund those. So it's a crowdfunding platform. So that's one thing. There's also the DNA Doe Project. They don't work suspect cases like this, but they do help to identify victims. And so they are a 501c3. They're one of the few nonprofits in this space. So they're a good option if you wanted to get involved more. They also take volunteers to help on the cases, which we aren't able to do with suspect cases for obvious reasons.
Right.
So hopefully there'll be something more created. It's certainly a project I've looked at quite a bit, is trying to create something, but we're not quite there yet. But those two, I'd say DNA Doe Project and Justice Drive are both good ways if you have some funds you want to donate toward some of these cases.
Amazing. That's so good to know.
I just wanted to thank you so much for your work and for taking the time out of your super busy schedule to do this. And same to Brittany, because Brittany was the one who really made all of this happen.
Yeah, thank you, Brittany. It's nice that you're so interested in this and that you do have such a big following and you can help get the word out about this.
Oh yeah, no, I would love chatting with you.
If you're interested in learning more about genetic genealogy or the cases that Cece and her team are working on, you can visit our website at dnadetectives.com or join the DNA Detectives group on Facebook. You can follow Brittany on Instagram at Brittany Xavier, that's BrittanyXavier, and on TikTok at Brittany.Xavier. V Wanna Know is produced by Ryan Killian Krause. I'm your host, Matthias. We'll see you next time.